Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that if you're returning. How are you today? In today's video, we're going to touch on something that we haven't spoken about in quite a few weeks. So this is about Venezuela, and this is the events, okay, that they went through in 2020, okay, and their crisis that they saw, they've been seeing, okay. And I feel that it's very important that we touch on this subject, okay, because we've been touching on a lot of subjects that have to do with crisis in different countries, okay, looking at their timelines. And then also, as you know, I've been doing a series on the Great Depression, okay? It's very important for us to look at things from different aspects so we can see, are we headed there? Okay? So, Venezuela, okay, is facing severe humanitarian emergency, with millions unable to access basic health care, adequate nutrition, limited access to safe water in homes and healthcare centers has contributed to the spread of the Rona. In September, a fact-finding mission appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, or HRC, found high-level authorities responsible for atrocities that they believed amounted to crimes against humanity. The government of Nicolas Maduro and its security forces are responsible for extrajudicial executions, short-term forced disappearances, and have jailed opponents, prosecuted civilians in military courts, tortured detainees, cracked down on protesters. They used a state of emergency implemented in response to Rona as an excuse to punish dissent and intensify their control over the population. Venezuela has been at a political impasse since Juan Guaido, the National Assembly president, claimed he was taking power as interim president of Venezuela in January of 2019. Maduro continued to control all institutions except for the legislative branch. In July, ahead of parliamentary elections scheduled for December of 2020, the Supreme Court ordered the takeover of 3 leading political opposition parties by Maduro government supporters and appointed government supporters to head the National Electoral Council, or CNE. Maduro supporters won 2/3 of seats to the National Assembly in elections held on December 6th, which were boycotted by the majority of opposition parties, and in which less than 1/3 of registered voters participated. Many governments from the region and Europe said the elections had not met minimum guarantees to be considered free and fair. Is any of this sounding familiar to you? Anyway, the exodus of Venezuelans fleeing repression and shortages of food, medicine, and medical supplies represents the largest migration crisis in recent Latin American history. Difficulty accessing legal status in their countries and economic hardships as a result of measures to curb the spread of Rona have led approximately 130,000 to return since March of 2020. Returnees are subject to abuse upon arrival. Persistent concerns include brutal policing practices, poor prison conditions, impunity for human rights violations, lack of judicial independence, and harassment of human rights defenders and independent media. Some 5.5 million of an estimated 32 million Venezuelans have fled their country since 2014. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported in October many Venezuelans abroad remain unaccounted. Causes for the exodus include political, economic, human rights, and humanitarian crises. Many Venezuelans abroad remain in irregular status, undetermining their ability to obtain work permits, send children to school, and access to healthcare, while making them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Government lockdowns to curb the spread of the Rona have caused migrants to lose their jobs in the informal sector, and approximately 130,000 have made arduous journeys back to Venezuela, many on foot. In Venezuela, returnees have been held often for weeks in overcrowded, unsanitary quarantine centers that likely contribute to the spreading of Rona. Authorities and government armed groups known as colectivos have threatened, verbally harassed, and mistreated returnees. The government has jailed political opponents and disqualified them from running for office. As of September 30th, prisons and intelligence headquarters held 348 political prisoners, according to the Penal Forum, a Venezuelan network of pro bono criminal defense lawyers. In August, Maduro announced pardons for 110 political prisoners, but fewer than half of them have been incarcerated for political motives, the Penal Forum reported. And some faced no charges. Many others remain in arbitrary detention or are subject to arbitrary arrest and prosecution. Some have been forced into exile, including oppositional leader Leopoldo Lopez, who fled in October. Lopez had been sentenced to 13 years in prison on unsubstantiated charges of inciting violence during demonstrations against the government in 2014, and spent years in a military prison and under house arrest. Intelligence and security forces have detained and tortured military personnel accused of plotting against the government. Authorities have tortured various detainees for information about alleged conspiracies to determine the whereabouts of some suspects. Authorities have detained and tortured family members. During several crackdowns since 2014, Venezuelan security forces and colectivos have attacked demonstrations. Security forces have shot demonstrators at point-blank range with riot control munitions, brutally beaten people who offended no resistance, and staged violent raids on apartment buildings. Of more than 15,500 people arrested in 2014 and connected with protests, including demonstrators, bystanders, and people taken from their homes without warrants, some 9,255 had been conditionally released as of September 2020, but remain subject to prosecution. A total of 870 had been prosecuted by military courts. The government had used the Rona state of emergency as a pretext to repress dissent, arbitrarily detaining and prosecuting dozens of political opponents, including legislators, journalists, healthcare workers who criticize the government's handling of the pandemic, and lawyers who provide legal support to demonstrators protesting lack of access to water, gas, or medicines. In July, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported 16 cases of alleged torture and ill treatment from June of 2019 to May of 2020, saying the actual number could be significantly higher. And the cases include severe beatings with boards, suffocation with plastic bags and chemicals, waterboarding, electric shocks to eyelids and genitals, exposure to cold temperatures, and being handcuffed for extended periods of times. In some cases, doctors issued false or inaccurate medical certificates not disclosing signs of torture. Between 2016 and 2019, police and security forces killed more than 19,000 people, alleging resistance to authority. OHCHR and analyzing open sources found 2,000 individuals had been killed in security operations between January and August of 2020, and many of these deaths may constitute extrajudicial executions, according to OHCHR. Agents of FAES, a special police force, and others have killed and tortured with impunity in low-income communities, instilling fear and maintaining social control. Previously, security force raids on low-income communities from 2015 through 2017, called Operations to Liberate the People, had resulted in widespread allegations of extrajudicial killings, mass arbitrary detentions, mistreatment of detainees, and forced evictions. Authorities have relied on colectivos to disperse demonstrations and crack down on protesters. During the pandemic, these groups have also helped authorities engage in social control and attack and intimidate political opponents and journalists, sometimes to prevent coverage related to the Rona. Colectivos have enforced the lockdown in neighborhoods and high levels of poverty. Local groups report beating and torturing those who allegedly fail to comply. Illegal mining in Bolivar states is controlled by criminal groups, syndicates, which police citizens, impose abusive working conditions, and viciously treat those of theft and other offenses, sometimes dismembering and killing them in front of others. The syndicates operate with government involvement. Armed groups, including the National Liberation Army, Patriotic Forces of National Liberation, and groups that emerge from the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, operate mostly in border states. In a poor state, and that's APURE, they establish and brutally enforce curfews, prohibitions on RAPE, theft and murder, and regulations governing everyday activities. They engage in murder, RAPE, forced labor, child recruitment to establish social control. Impunity is the norm, and residents say security forces and local authorities often collude with the armed groups. Between 2017 and the first trimester of 2020, the Attorney General's office reported initiating 4,890 investigations into killings in the context of security operations, of which 13 had resulted in trials and 1 in a homicide conviction in March. It reported 517 state agents charged and 26 convicted for torture and or ill treatment, and 44 individuals charged, 10 detained while awaiting trial for human rights abuses during protests in 2014, 2017, and 2019. Impunity for human rights abuses remains the norm. In July, OHCHR reported contributing factors including security forces tampering with crime scenes, withholding information, conflict of interest, security forces intimidation, threats, and reprisals against victims and their families. The judiciary stopped functioning as an independent branch of the government when former President Hugo Chavez and supporters in the National Assembly took over the Supreme Court in 2004. Supreme Court justices have openly rejected the separation of powers and have consistently upheld abusive policies and practices. Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni, AFIUNI, has been the subject of an arbitrary prosecution since 2009 when she granted conditional release to a government critic. Following a recommendation by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, she spent a year in prison, several under house arrest while charges were pending against her. The Supreme Court ruled in July 2019 that she no longer had to regularly present herself before the courts, but she was not allowed to leave the country, speak to media, or use social media. In July, SEBIN agents raided her home looking for evidence against her daughter, who worked with opposition leader Juan Guaido in the United States. The government has not published epidemiological data since 2017, when the health minister released figures showing maternal mortality increasing by 65% in 2016 and infant mortality by 30%. Days later, the minister was fired. Venezuela's health system is in collapse, leading to the resurgence of the preventable and infectious diseases, shortages of medications and health supplies, interruptions of basic utilities at healthcare facilities, and the emigration of healthcare workers have led to a decline in operational capacity. The World Food Program estimates that 1 of 3 Venezuelans is food insecure and in need of assistance based on data collected prior to the pandemic. The 2020 National Security of Life Conditions reported 8% of children under 5 acutely malnourished, 30% chronologically malnourished or stunted. In the most vulnerable neighborhoods, 14.4% of children under 5 are malnourished, Caritas, a non-governmental organization, reported in July. Many families are having difficulties feeding older children, in part due to the decline of school meal programs. School attendance, which had already decreased due to humanitarian emergency, had declined further because of Rona restrictions. In-person classes suspended in March remain suspended at time of writing. As of November 2nd, Venezuela had confirmed 92,325 cases of Rona and 801 deaths. Given the limited availability of reliable testing, lack of government transparency, and persecution of medical professionals and journalists who report on the pandemic, the actual numbers are likely much higher. Limited access to water in hospitals and homes, overcrowding in low-income areas, and prisons likely contribute to the rapid spread. Most healthcare centers face severe shortages of basic equipment such as gloves, face masks, alcohol gel, and soap. Lack of basic x-ray equipment, laboratory tests, intensive care beds, and respirators likely heighten the death rate. Access to maternal health and reproduction services, which was already dire due to the humanitarian emergency, has further deteriorated due to the pandemic. UNOCHA estimates an 80% shortage of contraceptive methods, reported that 352 women died during pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum in 2019. Maternal health centers have suspended pre- and postnatal services due to the pandemic, and NGOs reported that pregnant women suspected of having Rona have been denied prompt care. Despite repeated efforts to unseat it and a spate of judicial rulings invalidating its decisions, the National Assembly remained Venezuelans' only democratically elected institution in 2020. The opposition won more than 2/3 of seats in 2015. At the time of writing, a legislative election was scheduled for December 6. A coalition of 27 political parties led by Guaido was planned to boycott it, protesting persecution and opposition politicians and lack of guarantees for a free and fair process, including the political takeover of opposition parties by the Supreme Court in mid-2020. In 2017, Maduro ignored the constitutional requirement of public referendum to rewrite the Constitution and decreed a constituent assembly to do so. The assembly, consisting exclusively of government supporters, has effectively replaced the National Assembly. It has extended its mandate until December 2020 and lifted parliamentary immunity for several opposition legislators. For more than a decade, the government has expanded and abused its power to regulate media and close dissenting outlets. The government can suspend websites for vaguely defined incitement, prosecute disrespect for high government officials, revoke media licenses if convenient for the interest of the nation, and has blocked websites critical of the government. While a few newspapers, websites, and radio stations criticize authorities, fear of reprisals has made self-censorship a serious problem. In 2017, the Constituent Assembly passed a vague law against hatred, forbidding political parties that promote fascism, hatred, and intolerance, and established prison sentences of up to 20 years for publishing messages of intolerance and hatred. During the state of emergency, many people sharing or publishing information on social media, questioning officials or policies, have been charged with incitement to hatred or to commission of a crime. Oh. All right, guys, I'm going to end this video because I don't want it to be too long, but I'll pick it up in another one. All right. I love you. I'll see you in the next one. All right. Stay safe, stay positive, keep prepping. And as always, fear less. Ciao.